Hi, friends. Pastor Terry here. We are Dalhousie Church, and this is the 10-Minute Coach. I want to take you back into 1 Kings, 2nd Chronicles, the Proverbs, Song of Songs, the book of Ecclesiastes. Those are all places where we encounter something, at least, about King Solomon. He is thought to have written many of the 500 and some of the proverbs that we find recorded in the book of Proverbs. He is thought to be the author behind Song of Songs, or at least that's traditionally. Everything gets scholarly debated. I think it makes sense to me. Book of Ecclesiastes, meaningless, says the teacher, Kohelet. The teacher has gathered wisdom. He's been the king of Jerusalem and has attained more wealth than all who've gone before him. It sounds a lot like Solomon. I don't think anyone after Solomon ever could have made that claim. Some scholars would say, well, it's someone kind of writing on behalf of Solomon with a "this is what he would say" type of stuff. I'm going to go with Solomon. And he talks about all of the things that he has done and experienced, and then comes to the conclusion that in the end, all we can do is serve God and obey Him, and this is actually where satisfaction in life is to be found. Now, if only Solomon could have practiced what he preached. Listen to what I say, not what I do. Man, his life becomes a wreck. And it seems to be founded on this idea that when he prayed for wisdom, this beautiful, beautiful prayer for wisdom, God grants it to him, but there's a test attached to all of this, and that is, what are you going to do with it? Comes the parables that Jesus told come to mind. The talents, that which was given and trusted. Well, what do you do with what you are given? And I think that may be a big part of the problem that Solomon encountered. Now, I've given you some questions in the back of the sermon notes. We kind of walked through this preferred picture of King Solomon, the young man who prays this beautiful prayer. He's roughly age 20. This enormous wealth that he attains, that is comparable to the wealthiest people who have ever been known in history, comparable to the kings of ancient Mesopotamia. They've had discoveries of gold goblets and such in archaeological digs in different parts of the world. Mesopotamia, the pharaohs of Egypt, of course. If you've ever seen the King Tutankhamun display, I saw it when I was a kid. Just astounding gatherings of gold. It begins to give us this idea of what's there, and of course I drew the connection for you on Sunday that this Solomon is increasingly... David started kind of following the patterns of the kings around him, and that seemed to be the beginning of his downfall. Solomon goes full in on this whole be like the kings around me thing, to the extent that he begins to sound like, look like Pharaoh himself. He even enslaves his people and engages in terrible economic practices in order to gather and retain this enormous wealth. And it never spells it out clearly for us like that, though all of the overtures are there. Our narrator is always subtle, telling a story and then inviting us to pick up the allusions that are there. So I've given you some questions about how we hear God speak. I would love you to venture into that. Last year, I first encountered a guy named Jamie Winship, Winship. If you look him up on YouTube, he's a guy who has experienced extraordinary things in his lifetime as he has sought to walk in obedience to the voice of Jesus in war-torn parts of the world, bringing peace, bringing reconciliation. Extraordinary stories, definitely worth looking up. He's written a book called Living Fearless, which is also worth reading. How do you hear the voice of God, and how do you respond to Him? We talk about some of the interesting things that we encounter in the text as you're reading through. Like, man, that guys and grills barbecue that they had was astounding volumes of meat. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 62 and 63. Why so much? Well, maybe kind of it certainly seems excessive, and I think that's part of the point of the text. But there's also this excessiveness in response to the excessive grace, the excessive kindness of God. How many people did it take to eat 200,000 sheep? I expect there was a big crowd there, and I expect everybody took home lots of leftovers after a week of feasting, and there were probably some meat sweats after some of those significant feasts. But it was a celebration of what God had done in His provision, and to the one who's been so extraordinarily generous, they expressed generosity to Him. There's an invitation for us to evaluate our worship. How extravagant is the worship that you bring? David danced before the Ark of the Covenant as it was brought back into Jerusalem. Solomon celebrates the completion of the temple. We have these beautiful expressions of worship, intimacy with God, and it's wonderful. And it does not seem to last. Which kind of gets to the big idea for this week, which we've been talking about, the idea that God has no grandchildren, every generation must choose for themselves, but there's also this reality that the generation who chooses must continue to choose. When I give God my yes, it's just going to be the first of 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 yeses that I need to keep giving to Him in order to walk with Him. Now that concept maybe takes us into some really difficult questions about theology, questions that Christians have wrestled with since the beginning of time, but certainly throughout the Christian era of the last 2,000 years. Once saved, always saved, eternal security, can I lose my salvation? Be careful not to get into the weeds of those. I think the problem with those questions, and they're valuable theological discussions, but the problem with them is that we get into this place of speculation, attempting to understand the mind of God, attempting to understand another human being's heart and the decisions that they've made, and we cannot do that. What we must do is implore one another to continue giving God your yes. Continue giving God your yes. In case you or your group want to talk a little bit more about whether this assessment of King Solomon is accurate, is a fair assessment, because I know a lot of our children's stories, a lot of our Sunday school curriculums over the years, at least the ones I encountered as a child, they celebrated David as a hero. They celebrated Solomon as a hero. And the misguided part of that is the only hero in these stories is God. He is the hero of the biblical text. And the stories of David, stories of Solomon, need to point us to the greatness of God. And I keep talking about the grace that we find throughout the pages of the Old Testament. Don't believe the person who says the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament, that He's a God of wrath and judgment. And that's nonsense. The God is consistent throughout, and we see throughout the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures His grace poured out time and time and time and time again. And the reality is, judgment will come. The wrath of God will be poured out upon sin. And thus we appeal to those around us. When God opens the door, we appeal and we say, will you? Will you consider Jesus? I'm going to start introducing something I introduced at our AGM, and that is a bookmark that I want to give to you, and inviting you to put a list of people that need Jesus on the bookmark and pray for them. Pray for them. And the little axiom is this. Before I talk to my friends about Jesus, I want to talk to Jesus about my friends. And then on the flip side of the card, it says, start with prayer, share a cup, share a meal, share my friends. I'll explain that more in the weeks to come. But the the point here is that we want to be those who are choosing Jesus now and continuing to choose him, and that there is something profound going on in the biblical text that is criticizing Solomon for the choices that he made, or the yeses he did not give to God, the places where he allowed syncretism, the mixing of faith expressions, to cloud his judgment and ultimately draw him away from Yahweh and the worship of the one true God. I'll let you dig into some of the New Testament passages that I've given you there, and if you have questions beyond what you can discern here, give me a ring, drop me an email. I'm Pastor Terry Lee, and we are Dalhousie Church, and this has been the 10-Minute Coach. Bless you, and bye for now.